So what I put together is just more historical, cultural context of women at this time period. It's a huge, broad stroke to say something like that because even like our society today, there's so many layers of influence and so many types of subpopulations that influence the day-to-day life. So a lot of this is a lot of generalizations, but I'm going to start sort of bigger and then work into smaller subpopulations. But in general, and this is all as pertains to women, okay, women's life. In general, the eastern part of the empire, which would be more like Turkey, right, in that direction, was committed to patriarchy and the subordination of women as a generalization. More west, especially including Egypt, women were tended to have more opportunities to be educated, and in a lot of time, and oftentimes, or even in equal stat, not status to men, but were seen just as valuable in terms of being listened to. Then, of course, you had groups who fell in tension somewhere in between. The women in the Mediterranean, there's a lot of different subpopulations. We're going to first talk about family honor, which, of course, women have a huge influence, but family honor as a general value in the Mediterranean was huge. The family name and honor was more important than the individual. Conversely, in America, I would say the individual probably has more honor, right, than our family name. But that was very different back then. Men were expected to defend the family in face of public challenges and threats, and women were expected to embody family by their modest and chaste behavior. So even as an individual woman, how I behaved reflected not just myself, but my family, and as my family extends even to my household. The life course of women, if you were not an elite class girl, which most people were not, they were educated primarily in the home with duties by her mother and other females in their household. She was expected to marry a man of her parents' choosing, of course, very different to us. She was expected to marry in her late teen years. The marriage was an arrangement, included a dowry, probably consisting of household items that she would need, like linens, kitchenware, things of that nature. The ancient world bridal shower, I suppose. Her husband was oftentimes, it wouldn't be uncommon to have him be about 10 years older than you. So, wow, an 18-year-old marrying a 28-year-old, that's a big age difference.
That's what my mom did.
That's your mom. There you go.
So Deb and I did say.
And if her family had any property, it legally belonged to her family first, rather than to her family into which she married. That makes sense. And that's going to tie in a little bit more importantly as time goes on in this class. Married women who have children, very sadly, about half the children would die. So to have a child that actually survived to age 10 would be a pretty monumental occurrence. It was a dismal life expectancy. Old age, like old age, would be considered 60. And so a woman who would be getting married in her late teens to a man much older, more than likely would be widowed. And if she had been widowed while she was still at childbearing age, she would be expected to get remarried again. And then that could happen yet again. She could be widowed again. And so when you even hear Paul talking so much about widows, it was such an important topic because there were so many women that would have been widowed at that time, especially multiple times. If she didn't remarry and she was in the childbearing age, that would have been very uncustomary and perhaps maybe even frowned upon. As a woman, so let's say you get married young and you've been widowed 2 or 3 times. She's had several children at this point, and they're probably adults at this point. She may be, I'm 45, my age at this time. This woman would be the one that Paul would talk a lot about as in terms of the older women, and she would command the most respect from her family and also possess the most social power within her life course. She's experienced so much of life, which makes sense. But with that in mind, considering even that the early assembly of disciples was so much in the home, right? They met in house church, they met in their home. This woman really would have had a very increasingly important role, even in church life, as time went on. Because if she didn't have a spouse and then she was with her children, it was expected that her children would be caring for their adult parents, maybe unlike America, right? It was what was expected. And but these women were very influential. And, Paul talks about in Titus and other letters the importance of teaching. And I'm going to butcher the Greek word, but it's kalodisaskalio. And it's actually one word that means a teacher of what is excellent. And these women were teachers of what was excellent. And so that was a coined term. And in Titus, you note that the younger women were expected to be addressed, not specifically by Titus or the men, but by these older women. This kind of gender and age structure with which older women are responsible for younger women was common in many cultures, but was very, very prevalent. This constant idea of a community very tied in was very prevalent. Older women often acted as surrogate mothers or patrons to younger women. There is a 2nd century Christian story of a woman named Thecla, and she's supported emotionally and financially by a surrogate mother. So not her own mother, because perhaps her own mother had died at that point. But as this woman faced martyrdom, the older woman very much acted as a mother on her behalf. Perhaps Tabitha's good works and acts of mercy may have been part of her role as a patron to younger women when people would speak of her. And especially if a woman had wealth, she would have even greater influence. There is a 1st century memorial inscription. It's called In Praise of Turia. I don't know. A man recalls how his wife served as a mother to her female kin, her perhaps orphaned nieces and nephews, taking them into her home, providing them with dowries for good marriages. And so even in just ancient writings, you see this type of thing exemplified. And Paul talks about this, why older women are to teach younger women these things, and he says, so that the word of God would not be criticized or maligned, that the values and influence that they have was one of the ways to protect even God's word and the gospel message. Family ties. So I had mentioned this a little bit beforehand, but in ancient Roman society, filial piety is the word, but it was a prime cultural value. Adult children always cared for their parents. It wouldn't, we would not, even a nursing home would be unthinkable, of course. That neglect of a parent was seen as scandalous, and even an unbeliever would never do such a thing. Paul addresses these types of things. So Paul is very adamant about what's deemed proper, very, very specifically in the different letters, and that what's proper should govern the behavior of the community. He addresses specifically the problems that would lead to divisiveness or problematic teaching or just the reputation of the community at large. And then in this world, the Hellenistic time is from Alexander the Great, which is 3rd century BC, 300 and so. So once he died, this Hellenistic time period of great Greek influence permeated all of where we're standing. And even though then it became the Roman Empire, the Hellenistic influence was still strong, and a lot of that influenced the politics, government, organizational structures, and that type of thing. We even see university structures that we have today. And the Greek people, as a general thing, for the women in particular, their sphere was very much at home. And so it's interesting even that, what is that, the acra that we're standing in, that she was mentioning even it would be more the men here, because the women wouldn't be seen out and about. They would be very much at home, taking care of things at home. The focus with Greek women was to protect the reputation of young women and the legitimacy of their children. So if a woman was seen out and about, she could be seen as, maybe a scandalous type woman. And so very much they were stuck to home. There's a Jewish rabbi, Ben Sirach, that many of you may have heard about, but he speaks of just his own mentality of women at that time, which there's one writing that says having a girl is a disgrace to have a daughter. Of course, we have 3 daughters in our family. I'm like, that's just unthinkable today. But the women were seen as evil temptresses and the cause of sin in the world. There was just a very kind of a negative mindset on women, that daughters were a colossal disaster to families. women were not necessarily looked on favorably in a Greek culture, which is, again, where it's so incredible, where Paul in Acts it states that he converted a number of prominent Greek women. So somehow he was able to reach their hearts and the desires deep in their hearts for, of course, that freedom in life that we want as humans. But somehow he was able to influence these women that would otherwise have been, not thought of highly, of course, at all. So then you have a more specific area, this Macedonian region, which is where we are, northern Greece. Philippi and Thessaloniki are located here. And Macedonian women typically enjoyed greater freedom and power than many of the other women at this time, more so than your typical Greek woman, which is what I mentioned at first. And this is where Lydia enters the scene, right? And I know that Deb's going to do a great lesson on Lydia. But she, it could be that's a situation that Lydia encountered is when women were married at this time, they could have a choice of this situation called sine manu, which is without her husband's control. So if I came from money and I got married, the arrangement could be that the money is still tied. I'm still tied to my family's money, so that if my husband died, or that I still am tied to my family's money. And if that's the case, a lot of these women, when they became widows, would be positioned really well to have their own business. And no, they may not have the social, political power that a man may have had, but again, working from home and they have a very socially very influential, as they have people in and out of their homes and they're working from that environment. They're very an opportunistic, they take the opportunity to then influence those around them. And some of these women, if they'd come from money, would have had business dealings from their home. There could have been a different situation called a sui luris, where they're if a woman had 3 or 4 children, which I had to laugh because we have 4 children, you could have this status, sui luris, where then you're actually more independent financially. I thought, isn't that interesting? The more children you have, the more independent financially you were. Women without money would have been slaves, filling roles as lady maids to farm workers, and they even would have served maybe as gladiators. There's evidence of women gladiators back then. Yeah. Then we're going to get to visit the island of Crete, I believe. And geographically, that's a much more isolated region of Greece. So it would make sense that they would be a little bit more isolated from some of the Hellenistic influences. So the women in Crete did have a little bit more independence financially, a little bit more independence socially than mainland Greek women would have. Then, of course, at this time period, you have Hebrew women. And with the diaspora, you have women that are, going into these areas, right? So Paul had heard of that there were women and perhaps men that were Jewish in Philippi, which is what led him to come to, I thought of in our 2-hour drive, what a commitment his walk was to spread the gospel, that he would walk that far. I don't know how long. Oh my goodness. In the hopes of spreading the gospel. That just is so incredible to me. But Jewish women, they weren't as restricted as Greek women, but they certainly weren't as free as these Roman or Macedonian women. And their influence was greater on the family than men's typically, because again, they were more tied to their house. And just starting to think even about some of these details when you read through the letters of Paul could shed some light on why he specifically addresses certain areas for women, especially some of those trickier ones. But for a Jewish woman, her purity and modesty were paramount. It was just extremely important that even if she was out and about with her husband speaking to him, that could be like a public display of affection. So that, which is, I thought that was kind of funny actually when I heard that, but the women would have definitely worn like a long sleeveless overgarment. Even the more traditional Roman women would have worn a stola, and then they would have had their hair covered by a mantle. If they left their homes uncovered, that would have been a scandal. So it was, if she left without her head covered, her husband actually had the right to put her away. If she was caught in adultery, then she had to remove the head covering and could no longer walk around with that on. And because the head covering really revealed who you were on the inside. whether you were a respectable woman or not. So it wasn't just simply a thing. It meant a lot to the people who at that time. And an adulterous woman couldn't wear a stola. She had to shave her head and wear a plain toga. So again, thinking of some of those scriptures, like, okay, maybe what is that meaning when Paul is talking? What could that potentially be meaning when he's talking about women's head coverings and the way that they're wearing their hair? Then, I was saying that the Roman Empire just is a huge influence in this area. And so the culture penetrated all the cultures of that day. Maybe in some ways it would be like westernization of a lot of other countries throughout the world, that it's kind of hard to escape the American influence in other countries, right? We just drove here and saw a Lidl on the way here, and you see a Hardee's, and it's just hard to escape. I think back then it would have been very similar, this Roman influence. It just permeated so many things. And women, at that time, the Roman women were beginning to see a little bit more, got a little bit more liberty and a higher status. They may have held some civic offices, served as priestesses. They certainly had traditional roles like wives, mothers, traditional roles like prostitutes, midwives, and wet nurses. Those were traditional roles. But they also had new roles as physicians and musicians, artists and poets, and those things were, of course, unheard of prior to that. There's this huge movement, that's the way I think about it, called the new woman, or the Roman woman. And perhaps she was the pendulum swing from the Greek Hellenistic view of women. I'm not exactly sure. I'm sure other people know that better. But she is kind of like this woman I describe it, this woman of this independent attitude. Like, I'm not going to live like that under a patriarchal society. I'm going to do my own thing. And she pursued her own pleasure, her own social life, often at the expense of her own family and household. And she would not want to spoil her figure during pregnancy, and so to be pregnant, she wouldn't want to do that. Which that was one of the ways, of course, to pass on family. And when you're thinking of the whole bigger picture, that family is more important than individual, this woman, by making a statement like that, is doing the absolute opposite and trying to just focus on herself instead of the bigger picture of her family life. And even just the thought of nursing her own child was just despised, so she would employ somebody else to nurse her child. Just the whole, and then, she would tend to dress very extravagantly with gold and pearls and extravagant hairstyles. She would not, if she were married, would not wear the prototypical marriage veil. And that really would send a strong message. Like, I am this new woman ideal. I am not going to live the same way that this patriarchal society had impressed on me. And so again, thinking of some of the things that Paul addresses to the women in the churches, and the why would he address some of these things, could be that they didn't want to be perceived incorrectly as women who were taking a stance against family, against community, against one another. So try to think. There's this papyrus fragment that was found AD 246 and 246. There is in 263, there was this woman who was petitioned to act without a Kyrios, is that the word? Kyrios, or Lord, and that she could actually, that there were women that would want to conduct business without a Kyrios, without a Lord. They just didn't want anybody heading over them. And so, again, when Paul's addressing things about Lord in your life, there's a subpopulation of women that concept was against what they were trying to live for as this new woman. And then Caesar Augustus reigned during this time period, of course, of Jesus' birth, and he actually had a large campaign to reverse this new woman ideal. He did not like that at all. He'd actually enact severe punishments and banish women if they were found guilty of adultery. This actually included his own daughter, which is how strongly he felt about it. He actually would give financial penalties to remain single. Or if you didn't want to have children, you would be penalized for that, and you would have rewards for having children. Which again, I was like, we have 4 kids. We would have had a reward back then.
Next break.
Political advancement, financial independence, that type of thing. And like I did say this earlier, a traditional Roman matron, even, so not just a Jewish woman, but a traditional Roman matron would have worn this stola and a head garment over her for that. And what those garments would have indicated is that she was, it actually would have been there to protect her from unwanted sexual advances, because it would say, I am unavailable, I am married, I am. And so even to take that off and to not wear that was a very large statement at that time. There's no like one size fits all in terms of this time period. And I think that's something that was mind-blowing to me, is just how many influences and how many layers of culture were going on at that time, that when we read the letters, it's really challenging for me to not put my 21st century lens on and read into it as I would respond as somebody living at this time period, and not necessarily assume, because I know something about women at that time period, that would also address blanket statements, if that makes sense.
Right.
It's kind of like saying everybody in America is just the same. You can't say that, right? Southwest Virginian, somebody from LA, very, very different. And that's saying, so I'm hoping some of this gets your juices flowing even as you read back into the scriptures as to the why Paul may have written some of the things that he wrote. And I think that is it. It's about to rain. So,
All right. There you go, Betsy.